Hi, I'm Cam.
And I'm Dev.
And you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up.
Do you love listening to the Criminalish podcast? Want to hear more from Cam and Dev? Then consider becoming a subscriber for $2.99 a month. Subscribers will have exclusive access to minisodes, Dev and Cam's live reactions to crime shows and documentaries, as well as early access to any multi-part episodes and so much more. Click the link in the description if you're interested in subscribing. See y'all in Cell Block C.
Okay, y'all, so it has been a few weeks since Dev and I last recorded. Of course, this was the Thanksgiving holidays. I was home for a few weeks, so we actually knocked out like 3 different episodes last time we recorded. So let's get back into it. And I'm going to ask you, what you drinking, friend?
It's good to be back, friend. And I am drinking an iced caramel latte from a company that America may or may not run on, as well as some water in my recyclable bottle. What about you, friend?
I am drinking some tea. It's burdock root tea. I'm trying to get in my herbalism bag and try different things. And I am also drinking some water in a glass cup.
Yes, glass.
So before I get into today's case, I did want to extend a few trigger warnings. During this case, we will be discussing sexual assault, homophobia, and abuse by police officers. So Dev, today I will be telling you the story of the murders of Rocio Wanninkhof and Sonia Carabantes. Have you heard of this case before?
Absolutely not. I can say that with full certainty.
So for our listeners, this case is going to be taking place in Spain, and I will definitely apologize in advance for any mispronunciation of any Spanish names or locations. Our case starts in 1999, and we're going to start the case by focusing on Rocio Wanninkhof. Rocio was a 19-year-old Dutch-Spanish teenager who at the time of her murder lived with her mother, Alicia Hornos, and her sister, Rosa. They lived in the coastal town of La Cala de Mijas, which is on the southern portion of Spain and is pretty close to the tip of Morocco if you ever look at it on a map. Rocio was a hardworking teenager, and she was actually working 2 jobs in the summer of 1999. She was working as an au pair and also as a waitress, and she was doing this to save up to fulfill her dreams of going to study to become a teacher. And so all this background brings us to the night of October 9th, 1999. Around 5:30 this evening, Rocio left to walk to her boyfriend's house. Her boyfriend was named Antonio Jose Jurado, and his house was about a 30-minute walk from hers. She told her mom that she would be back at 10 p.m. to change before going to the fair with Antonio and some of her other friends. However, Rocio didn't show up around 10 p.m., and Alicia just convinced herself that she must have decided not to come back to change and just gone straight to the fair. And she told herself that she'd see Rocio in the morning. And just to note this, morning actually meant morning because it is really common for like European teenagers to stay out super late with their friends and their parents not really think anything of it. For instance, Rosa's sister, who also went to the fair, got back around 3 or 4 in the morning. So the next morning, Alicia woke up to find that Rocio still had not returned home, and this was very out of character for her. According to Alicia, neither Rocio or Rosa, her sister, would ever spend the night somewhere else without letting their mother know. So she asked Rocia's sister, to check in with Antonio to see if Rocio had spent the night there and maybe just had forgotten to tell her mother. And when Rosa asked Antonio, he confirmed that Rocio had come to his place earlier the previous evening. They'd watched TV and she'd left to change for the fair around 9:30 p.m. They'd planned on meeting there with other friends later that night, but Antonio actually never made it to the fair because he fell asleep. But he'd heard from other friends that they'd seen Rocio there, so he figured that she'd gone and had had a good time. However, Alicia was still unsettled. She drove around town looking for Rocio, thinking that maybe she'd stayed with another friend or maybe she was still walking home. Her partner, Juan, tried to convince her that Rocio was probably just fine and she just had a wild night out like teenagers tend to do. He suggested they go for a walk to take her mind off of things, but on this walk, they came across a pair of Rocio's shoes. And Alicia was able to identify them as Rocio's shoes, not just because they look like shoes that she owned, but Rocio also had a special way of tying her laces, and the laces on these shoes were tied in that exact same way. Along with these shoes, they also found bloodstains, and Juan quickly called the Spanish Guard. And for context, the Spanish Guard is kind of like the provincial police force in Spain. They basically, among other things, handle all criminal cases that pop up in rural areas. So now let's get on to the investigation. When they got to the scene, investigators found multiple bloodstains as well as a tissue with some blood on it and tire tracks. Testing confirmed that the blood found at the scene belonged to Rocio. And the bloody tissue made investigators think that whoever had harmed her had offered her the tissue to clean herself. On top of these things at the scene, investigators had also found a cigarette butt. And further analysis determined that the cigarette had been smoked by a male. Now, La Cala de Mijas was a very small, coastal, kind of touristy town, but it's important to know that it was a pretty small town and people in the town are very tight-knit. So Rocio's disappearance quickly became big news in this small community. And something that was really heartening to see was just how quickly the community mobilized to find her. They didn't even have to be directed by the civil guard. They started setting up volunteer search parties by themselves. On the third day after Rocio's disappearance, a taxi driver came forward and said that he'd been driving near that path around 10 p.m. on October 9th, and he saw a car parked on the wrong side of the road. And when he passed this car, he heard screaming coming from the car. But instead of stopping and investigating, the driver was actually afraid that he was going to get carjacked or something, so he rolled up his windows and sped away. But he did get a glimpse of who was in the car, and he told police that he saw a man inside the car behind the wheel and described this man as someone in his 20s with short hair. There was so much support in the community to try and find Rocio. Alicia especially was on the front lines of trying to search for her daughter. They were going into rural houses, abandoned houses, asking people if they could search their property. If it was an abandoned house, they were trying to find a way to get in to see if they could get inside and search it. Like, they were searching everywhere in that area to try and find Rocio. The family that Rocio was an au pair for also came forward and offered the equivalent of $180,000 in exchange for any information about Rocio's disappearance. Of course, investigators start with the last person to see Rocio alive, her boyfriend, Antonio. And they did find a couple things strange about Antonio's story. For one, he would normally walk Rocio to her home, but he hadn't for some reason on that night. And since he lived somewhat close to the area where the bloodstain was found, investigators felt like he should have been able to hear any screams that had come from that area. They also found Antonio's story suspicious. He said that he'd fallen asleep after Rocio left. His mother also vouched for him. But police didn't really see this as a strong alibi. Antonio was questioned 6 different times on what happened to Rocio. His cell phone was tapped, and this wasn't just regular interrogation. Like, they would kind of do like a Jekyll and Hyde, good cop, bad cop thing on him, where they would be like, oh, we know that y'all must have just argued and you pushed her and she fell. And then another cop would come in and would basically be like physically assaulting him, saying that they know he did it and he needs to confess. And at one point, he even told his mother that he was just going to tell them that he did it because he couldn't take it anymore. And he was also out there looking for Rocio. And he was just telling his mother, I hope that I find her. And she was saying, I hope that you don't, because if you do, they're just going to say, oh, of course you found her. You were the one that killed her.
It is crazy to me that there was a time where police were not regulated and could put their hands on people to force confessions. It's crazy to me that we allowed that for so long, because that's 1999. This isn't, 1950, 1900. That's 24 years ago that we allowed police to beat a confession out of somebody.
Yeah, and I mean, this is Europe, so I don't even know what the regulations are on this now, because I remember the case of the woman in Italy whose roommate got murdered.
I know exactly what case you're talking about.
But they also used some very shady tactics when it came to her interrogation.
Definitely.
And I mean, this hurt Antonio hard. It's unclear how long he and Rocio were together, but Antonio's mom even said that she saw Rocio as like a second daughter. And that night, when he was supposed to go to the fair with Rocio, but fell asleep instead, he told his mom that he wasn't going to be going to the fair. And she was like, she's been so excited about going to this fair. Why aren't you going? And Antonio actually told his mom that the reason he wasn't going is because he didn't have any money. And he knew that if he told Rocio that he didn't have any money, she would decide to stay at home with him and spend time with him. But he wanted her to go to the fair with her friends because he knew that she'd been working so hard and that she deserved this. In the morning, when they'd found Rocio's shoes and the bloodstain, his mother had actually come into the room because she just gotten a call, and she just found him crying all alone in his room.
I'm okay. I'm just emotional right now.
It's sad. It's really sad because they're so young.
It is just so sad, and it just sounds like he really did love her. Even if we don't know how long they were together, he just seems like he talks about her in a way that says that he loves her. It just makes me so sad that he went through all of that with police when the night of, he was trying to make sure that he didn't damper the mood and bring down her shine, and made sure that she did something she wanted to do, even though he couldn't afford to do it, which I think says a lot about him as a partner, as a man. I'm so sad. I'm gonna cry. I'm just incredibly saddened by that.
Yeah, it's gonna be a sad case. I will say that. So eventually, investigators cleared Antonio because they found out that he doesn't actually have a driver's license. So it would have been highly unlikely that he would have been the one in the car that the taxi driver spotted. Which to me seems like something that should have been pretty clear at the forefront, and maybe you could have investigated this before putting him through multiple interrogations and putting your hands on him. But that's just me.
No, it's not just you, it's me too. I second this motion, because you're telling me that it took you... I might have to hold on to this one. Where's my notepad? I might need to get my notepad again, because I'm...
Oh yeah, you're gonna need to get your notepad. It's gonna be a whole lot of comments.
Please hold
in
on.
This one. I'm gonna have thoughts. I'm gonna have thoughts. So on October 31st, just a few weeks after Rocio's disappearance, the Spanish Civil Guard announced that they would be suspending the search. However, this did not stop the locals, who continued to go out and search for Rocio. On November 2nd, 1999, a little under a month after Rocio's disappearance, owners of a tennis club found the body that had been placed behind the courts and partially hidden by scrub. These tennis courts were nearly 20 miles from Rocio's home. And at first, investigators weren't sure that this was actually Rocio because the body was so badly decomposed. Investigators collected the evidence at the scene and found 2 garbage bags that had been placed near the body. One of them had belongings inside that seemed like they could belong to Rocio. Namely, there was some jewelry and a t-shirt that matched the description of what Rocio had been wearing the night she disappeared. They also found Rocio's missing persons flyer placed near the body. Once investigators collected the evidence, they also brought the body back for identification. Rocio's sister, Rosa, was asked to identify the body, and she was able to identify the body as Rocio based on a ring that was on her finger. The autopsy revealed that Rocio had been stabbed 9 times and beaten. Even though Rocio was found naked and her body was posed in a suggestive way, investigators could not find evidence of sexual assault and thought that she might have been posed that way to mislead investigators. So, multiple pieces of evidence led investigators to believe that the person responsible for Rocio's murder had to be someone close to the family. Specifically, the bloody tissue at the scene made them think that the killer had offered the tissue to Rocio for her to clean herself up, which made them think that there was some kind of pre-existing relationship between the two. Also, the missing persons poster at the scene told investigators that someone who'd been involved in the search was responsible for Rocio's murder. And lastly, the 9 stab wounds led investigators to think that there was a lot of animosity and hatred behind Rocio's killing. However, months passed with no break in the case. But in September of 2000, the Civil Guard informed Alicia, Rocio's mother, that they were close to making an arrest. And they informed her that they suspected Maria Dolores Vasquez of Rocio's murder. Now, who was Maria Dolores Vasquez? She was actually the ex of Alicia and had lived with Alicia, Rocio, and Rosa for about 15 years. And in September of 2000, Dolores Vasquez was arrested and charged with Rocio's murder. So I'm going to go into a little bit of background on who Dolores Vasquez is. So in 1981, Alicia was married to Rocio's father, a Dutch man named Guillermo Wanninkhof. Guillermo eventually left his wife and their 3 children when Rocio was 2 years old, but before this, he used to work at a hotel. And at this hotel, he met Dolores. Dolores also eventually purchased a house right next to Guillermo and Alicia, and eventually, she and Alicia were introduced and quickly became friends. Alicia and Dolores would spend a lot of time together. They would always drink tea together, and Alicia even said that Dolores made her start liking tea. Dolores, though she was born in Spain, she was actually raised in England, and so she had a very British education and just British way about her. And in England, 5 p.m. is tea time. So this became a bit of a habit for Alicia and Dolores. And especially after Guillermo left, Alicia and Dolores became even closer. Dolores would support Alicia in a lot of ways. If Alicia was late coming home from work, Dolores would pick up the kids. And by the time Alicia got home, the kids were bathed, fed, and had already been put to bed. And eventually, Alicia and Dolores developed romantic feelings for each other and began a romantic relationship. At one point, they even moved in together. And they seemed very happy. But after 15 years, they decided to end things. And it seemed like this was a pretty amicable split because they'd agreed to remain friends. And fast forward to 1999, when Dolores heard about Rocio's disappearance, she reached out to Alicia and offered her support. She participated in the searches and was spending time with the family pretty often. I mean, you got to remember, they were together for 15 years. And so And so Dolores not only knew Alicia and her children, she also knew Alicia's parents, Alicia's siblings, her siblings-in-laws. She knew the whole family, as well as the broader community. And at one point, Dolores even suggested hiring a private investigator because it had been months with almost no progress from the Spanish Civil Guard. But what Dolores didn't know was that investigators were looking into her pretty early on in the investigation. At one point, they'd noted a strange vehicle that had been going through the area where Rocio's shoes were found. And one time, two men got out of the car to look around the area and even inquired where police were in the investigation. When they ran the plates, they traced this car back to Dolores. And in an interview, when they asked Dolores whether or not she'd lent her car to anyone, she denied this, saying that she never lends her car to anyone. And so investigators felt like they caught her in a lie, and this was when they began to focus their attention on her. When investigators told Alicia this fact, at first she struggled to believe that Dolores could be behind Rocio's death. She was essentially like a second mother to Rocio. And Alicia even called Dolores that night and straight up accused her of Rocio's murder. And after Alicia asked Dolores, "Did you kill my daughter?" Rocio essentially responded with, "How can you ask me that?" But this answer didn't really satisfy Alicia, who felt like Dolores should have been protesting her innocence more if she were truly innocent. And on September 5th of 2000, the media officially named Dolores Vasquez as a suspect, 2 days before she was actually arrested. During this arrest, she was marched outside and was met with an angry crowd screaming at her, calling her a murderer, and even trying to physically harm her. All Dolores could do in that moment was to ask her neighbor who was standing nearby to call her sister and make sure that her mother was okay, because Dolores was caring for her sick and disabled mother, and in that moment, that's all she could think about. When investigators questioned her, Dolores insisted on her innocence, and she said that she was home the day that Rocio disappeared. She had been caring for her sick mother, and in general, she didn't leave her home very often because of this. Additionally, that night, her niece had come home and had come with her 2-year-old daughter and actually left her 2-year-old daughter in Dolores' care. And Dolores was telling investigators, "I wouldn't have left a toddler alone without anyone to care for her." On September 9th, Dolores was presented in front of a judge where the Spanish Civil Guard said that they had 20 pieces of evidence against her. Because Dolores had a sister in the UK, she was deemed a flight risk and was sent straight to jail to await trial. The more Alicia thought about her and Dolores' relationship, the more she realized that there'd been warning signs. When the kids were small, things were great. Dolores was caring and affectionate, but she felt like as the kids got older, Dolores became more controlling, and she always wanted them to do their chores and was really hard on them about getting good grades. One time, Dolores even grounded Rocio for a whole summer after she'd received some bad grades in school. And this made the hostility between Rocio and Dolores grow. One time, Rocio even proclaimed to her mother that Dolores was going to kill her one day. In addition to the hostility between Rocio and Dolores, Alicia also had an issue with Dolores' mother. Dolores' mother and Alicia didn't really get along, and Dolores also wasn't forthcoming with her mother and her family about the nature of she and Alicia's relationship. And she essentially told her family that Alicia was the housekeeper.
How dare you?
Shortly after all of this, Alicia and Dolores broke up. They said that they would still be friends, but Alicia felt like Dolores didn't really take the breakup that well. After a few years, Alicia began dating her partner Juan, and she said that Dolores showed up at her door and was asking her intrusive questions. And Alicia said that she'd asked Dolores to stop with the questions after she felt like they became too much. And according to Alicia, Dolores told her that one day she'd hit her where it hurt the most. So let's now get to the evidence. Investigators didn't have much physical evidence, but they did have a good amount of circumstantial evidence. Prior to this, people would have described Dolores as a quiet and kind person who was reserved. But after her arrest, these same acquaintances described her as cold, detached, and insensitive. Her housekeeper also testified that she had a violent temper and that she once smashed a cup of tea because it was cold. But this was also contrasted with other people saying that she was overly emotional during searches for Rocio and at her funeral. Some said that she cried too hard in a way that seemed performative. A neighbor claimed that Dolores' niece and grandniece, who were the basis of Dolores' alibi for October 9th, had actually arrived on October 10th, the day after Rocio's disappearance. And a waitress at the bar near Dolores' house said that she'd come in around 11:30 to buy some tobacco. And when asked where she was coming from, she told the waitress that she'd just been on a run to clear her mind. The next day, Dolores had asked a friend to drive her to a wedding that they were both going to because her car was in the shop. And she'd commented to the friend that she'd had a restless night. Another piece of evidence that investigators presented was the fact that in the months leading up to Rocio's murder, Dolores would frequently call psychic hotlines, but after Rocio went missing, these calls virtually stopped. Investigators interviewed one of these psychics, and this psychic said that Dolores had confessed to her that she was still in love with Alicia, and she felt like Rocio was in the way of them being together. Investigators then theorized, based on all this evidence, that the following sequence of events must have taken place. Dolores must have gone for a run on the night of October 9th and had run into Rocio, who was on her walk home. Upon chatting, the hostility that was between them must have caused an argument to break out, and this caused Dolores to punch Rocio in the face. Investigators believe that this is where the tissue came from and assumed that Rocio must have given it to her to clean herself up. But while Rocio was distracted, Dolores must have stabbed her, and Rocio must have tried to run away but collapsed from her injuries. When she collapsed, Dolores then must have stabbed her repeatedly, leading to the other stab wounds. Investigators theorized that Dolores then went home and returned a few hours later with her car to dispose of Rocio's body. She must have put her body in the trunk and kept it there for a few days, which they believe explained why she'd needed the friend to drive her to the wedding. And after those few days, she must have tried to burn Rocio's body in her chimney and then dumped Rocio's body where it was eventually found. And they also believe that Dolores must have gotten help from some young men, which they believe explained why there was a cigarette butt with male DNA found at the scene, and why they'd seen those two men driving her car.
Did the police have evidence that Rocio's body had burns, or do you know what gave them the impression that Dolores had tried to burn her body in the fireplace?
Yeah, so there were two things. One was the waitress at that bar had claimed that she'd seen fire coming from Dolores's chimney a few days after Rocio's disappearance. And when asked about this, Dolores said that she was just cleaning her chimney, but the waitress felt like there was too much smoke for someone who was just cleaning their chimney. And police also had suspected that Rocio's body had been burned because it was so decomposed. I mean, the way that her body was decomposed, it had seemed like her body had been out there for 6 months rather than just under a month. So police had suspected that in general, her body must have been burned or something else had been done to it for it to have decomposed that quickly.
Okay.
So throughout the investigation, Dolores maintained her innocence. And while she was in jail, she did go through some mistreatment from officers. They put her in a cell and they would turn the lights on and off intermittently. And they would say, "We know you're afraid of the dark." And actually, Dolores even said herself, "I wasn't afraid of the dark, but I was claustrophobic." And she felt like she was going to die in that cell.
Dude, I don't care if you think she's a killer or not. Nobody needs to be tortured. That's insane.
And all of this was to try and get a confession out of Dolores. And luckily for Dolores, a few days after her arrest, a lawyer decided to take on her case. Looking at the media storm and the fact that police didn't actually have any physical evidence, he felt like this was not a strong case and that Dolores needed some support to balance out all of the people accusing her in the media, all the investigators accusing her.
Do you happen to know that if Spain, everybody is guaranteed the right to counsel like in the US, or do you have to seek private counsel in order to defend yourself against crimes that you are accused of?
So yes, the right to counsel is guaranteed in the Spanish Constitution. A little bit of background on this lawyer too. He was actually a friend of Dolores's estate lawyer for her father's estate, and her father had also asked him to do this. So he was motivated by personal connections, but he also did believe in Dolores's innocence and felt like she was not receiving a fair trial.
Understood. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So like I said, Dolores's case was highly publicized, with news anchors even debating her innocence. Most people had already decided that she was guilty before the trial even began. And in September 2001, the trial actually did begin. Hundreds of reporters and onlookers arrived, and Dolores pleaded not guilty. At the trial, Alicia testified that she had no doubt that Dolores was responsible for her daughter's murder. The prosecution, in lieu of physical evidence, brought out many character witnesses that talked about Dolores's dominant, cold personality. An undercover officer even testified that he'd befriended Dolores and he described her as cold. The jury deliberated for 30 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Dolores broke down in tears while Alicia and her family, along with others from the community, hugged each other and cheered. Dolores was sentenced to 15 years in prison and ordered to pay the equivalent of $220,000 in compensation to Rocio's family. When asked if she had anything to say, Dolores just muttered, quote, "Continue searching because the killer is still out there," unquote. After her guilty verdict, Dolores began to question her own memories. During a visit with her attorney, she asked him, "What if I did it and I can't remember it?" But her lawyer believed in her innocence and encouraged her to remain steadfast as he worked on an appeal. A few days after her conviction, a group made up of attorneys and researchers familiar with the case published a blog post stating their belief in her innocence, and they focused on the fact that Dolores was convicted without any physical evidence and there were too many holes in the prosecution's case. For one, Dolores had said that the night of Rocio's disappearance, she was babysitting her niece's daughter, and though a neighbor claimed that it was actually the next night, Dolores' niece backed up Dolores' timeline. The niece said that she'd arrived that night around 10 p.m., which was around the same time that Rocio was attacked. And prosecution had also brought out the call logs and the fact that Dolores had been calling psychics many times leading up to Rocio's disappearance, but these calls had seemingly abruptly stopped after Rocio disappeared. But in these call logs, there was also evidence that Dolores had made 2 calls to friends on the night of Rocio's disappearance. One call took place from 10:34 to 11:10, and the other call started at 11:17. And finally, the tire tracks found at the scene didn't match Dolores' car. They'd been left by a Ford Fiesta, and Dolores drove a Toyota. But to counter this fact, the prosecutors concluded that Dolores must have stolen a car. As the group made this post and raised these claims, more and more people began to question the guilty verdict.
She must have stolen a car based on what?
Because she's cold and calculated. And she's a lesbian.
Basically, if y'all just want to be homophobic, just godly, and God forbid she walk around looking masked, then y'all are definitely going to have nothing but negative things to say about her.
This is kind of a tangent, but it was something really interesting I heard when I was watching a documentary that's actually on HBO about this case. Someone was saying that around this time, there was a liberal lesbophobia, and what this spokesperson of the queer community in Spain was saying that around this time, the media would essentially make lesbianism invisible because it was taboo. So taboo that they didn't even want to bring it up. And the liberal part comes in as they would justify this as, oh, we don't really think it's relevant. We don't need to talk about that. But really, it was this fear of not wanting to talk about it at all and just to pretend that it wasn't happening. And I'll say, as someone who watches a lot of telenovelas, like usually see a storyline where there is a gay character and probably another gay character who's in the closet. But of all the novellas I've watched, I have not seen a lesbian couple in the novellas. So I feel like this is still a thing in Spain and broader Hispanic culture.
I just want to know why y'all are so scared of gay people. I just want to know, what grinds your gears about gay people? Why are y'all so scared?
The devil.
You're right. I forgot. It's Satan. Oh, right. We're in Spain. The Catholic Church still runs. Oh my God, that all just came together for me in this moment. Now, everything you just said makes perfect sense as soon as I remembered we were in Spain and the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
It all, in the words of Crunk, oh yeah, it's all coming together.
So on February 2nd, 2002, the Superior Court of Spain nullified Dolores' conviction and ordered a new trial. On February 8th, Dolores was released from prison with the caveat that she relinquish her passport and submit to any searches from the Spanish Civil Guard. Rocio's family was upset by this and felt like the Spanish Civil Guard and the justice system was placing them in danger because they still felt strongly that Dolores was responsible. On September 20th, 2002, Dolores held a press conference proclaiming her innocence and stating that she'd been convicted without proof. Her retrial was then scheduled for August 2003.
This is just a personal opinion of mine, but I never think it's a good idea for somebody who is accused of a crime to talk to the media. Because if you don't know, and maybe this isn't the case in Spain, even though it feels like they're very lax over there, so it probably would be, anything you say can and will be used against you. So those media statements come in your trial. So if you're like, I was never there, I'm completely innocent, that comes in at your trial. And God forbid they find evidence that debunks what you said on that press conference, you have lost all your credibility to the jury.
Yeah, and I think in Dolores' mind, she was trying to counter all of the negative media that was coming out about her. And she also felt a little bit emboldened by the fact that these researchers were on her side and more people were on her side and were calling out the fact that there wasn't any physical evidence placing her at the scene. There wasn't any physical evidence tying her to Rocio's disappearance and murder.
I agree. I think her feeling that way makes perfect sense because she has evidence in her favor. And if anything, the physical evidence that is there excludes her from the murder. But again, I just think, especially when you're dealing with a government that's fishing for a conviction or a confession, any and everything you say will come under scrutiny. And so in general, I always think it's a bad idea to talk to media, but I definitely understand her perspective and where she was coming from because she was under the gun for sure.
So in August of 2003, it seemed like the small towns in southern Spain were getting a sense of deja vu because during this month, 17-year-old Sonia Carabantes had disappeared. A little bit of background on Sonia before we get into what happened to her. So Sonia grew up in Switzerland, and at the age of 15, she moved to the town of Coin with her parents. On August 13th, 2003, the August Fair was in full swing in the town, and Sonia was attending it with friends. They were at the festival well into the night, and at the end of the night, which was around 5 a.m., again, European kids, they do things different.
Yeah, my mom would have never let that fly.
Mm-hmm. But at the end of the night, Sonia walked home with one of her friends, and when they were about a few minutes walk from Sonia's home, her and her friend parted ways so that her friend could continue on to her home, which was on the other side of town. But the next morning, Sonia's mom opened the front door to find a pool of blood on the pavement right outside her home. And as Sonia's mom walked more, she saw more blood, Sonia's purse, shoes, and her phone, which was broken on the ground.
Oh, that poor woman.
After calling the police, the Spanish Civil Guard arrived and investigated the scene. They found a broken taillight, a lock of hair that looked like Sonia's, a cigarette butt, and a tissue covered in blood.
It's giving signature.
On August 18th, just a few days after Sonia's disappearance, one of the search groups came upon a pair of jeans by the roadside. Upon hearing this, Sonia's father went to the area where the jeans were found with a clairvoyant who led him into a dense wooded area where she said she felt Sonia's presence. But after searching, they didn't find anything. The next morning, volunteers went to the same area with a sniffer dog, and this dog led the volunteers into the same wooded area that the clairvoyant had led Sonia's father into. However, the dog quickly took off in a direction and stopped right ahead of a mound of dirt. When the volunteers investigated this, they found Sonia's partially buried body. The autopsy revealed that even though the attack seemed sexually motivated because of the way that Sonia's clothing was placed, they could not find any evidence of sexual assault. Sonia had been beaten and strangled, but she'd put up a fight and gotten some of her killer's DNA under her fingernails. This same DNA was found on the cigarette butt outside of Sonia's home. And when they ran this DNA through the system, a match came up. The DNA matched to the cigarette butt that had been found at the scene of Rocio's disappearance. There were other similarities between Rocio and Sonia. They were only 2 years apart in age, and both had long brown hair that they wore in almost identical styles. And both girls had been killed while walking home. At the time of Sonia's murder, Dolores Vasquez was at home under police surveillance. And when the court learned that the two cases had been connected through DNA evidence, they postponed Dolores' retrial.
Postponed? You should just go ahead and dismiss the case. That's what you should have done.
Then they'd have to really admit they were wrong.
Of course, and the government never wants to admit they're wrong.
Investigators also examined other unsolved cases in the area to determine if they were dealing with a serial killer. Because based on the evidence and some of the signatures, they believed that this person had killed before. Soon after Sonia's body was found, a woman named Cecilia came forward to the Spanish Civil Guard and said that she suspected her ex-husband, a British expat named Tony Alexander King, was responsible for the crimes. Cecilia said that a couple days before, he'd come to pick up their daughter, and she and her current boyfriend noticed that his hand was swollen and covered with scratches. When Cecilia's boyfriend asked Tony about this, he said that he'd been speeding in his car and had hurt himself. But of course, this wasn't really believable considering that Tony didn't have any head wounds. And you'd expect that if somebody was in some type of crash and they had cuts, that they would definitely have some type of head wound. Cecilia also told investigators that a few years earlier, when they were still married, a friend had told her that she'd seen her husband Tony on a British television show about wanted criminals. But when Cecilia called Scotland Yard, which is the police headquarters for Greater London, to ask about Tony, they told her that he'd just been committed of a string of robberies. So believing that his crimes weren't violent, she chose to let this go.
When her friend brought that up to her, they were already married, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So it's not like she could have easily left him if she...
Right.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Cecilia also told investigators that she remembered very clearly that on the night of October 9th, 1999, Tony had come home close to midnight, went straight into the bathroom and locked the door. When he came out, she noticed that he had some small cuts and was holding blood-stained clothes, which he insisted on washing himself. When she saw the news about Rocio a few days later, she couldn't shake the feeling that her husband was involved. She even reported her suspicions to police, but the officer who interviewed her never wrote the report and never followed up with her. And this made her reluctant to speak out again in 2003 after Sonia's death. And one of her friends was the one to actually call the police and make the initial report on Cecilia's behalf. On September 17th, 2003, officers went to King's apartment where he lived with his new girlfriend, but instead of arresting him right away, they wanted to wait and watch a little bit to see if he would try to flee, because they didn't know whether or not he'd found out that Cecilia had made this report to police. But based on his movements, it didn't really seem like he was aware that Cecilia had reported him. While they were watching Tony's home, they noted that the car in his garage matched the description of a vehicle that had been seen driving near Sonia's home the night of her murder. And this car also had a broken taillight. The following morning, police arrested Tony for Sonia's murder. During the investigation, police found out that Tony was a 38-year-old British man who'd moved to Spain 6 years prior. Over the 10 hours that he was interrogated, Tony King confessed to Sonia and Rocio's murders. He claimed that on the night of August 13th, 2003, when Sonia disappeared, he'd been out with his girlfriend, and after they'd returned home, he couldn't sleep, so he went out for a drive. And due to him being a little bit inebriated, he hit a teenage girl, who he later realized was Sonia. And unsure of what to do, he put her body in his trunk and kept driving. At one point, he claimed that he had moved her body from the trunk to the back seat and attempted to abuse what he believed was her dead body. But Sonia regained consciousness and tried to fight him off. At this point, King strangled her. Tony King also admitted to Rocio's murder, and he claimed that this night he was spending the night at a friend's house and had borrowed his friend's car, which was a Ford Fiesta, to go for a drive. While he was driving, he spotted Rocio walking and decided to follow her with his car. Eventually, he passed her so that he could stop his car, get out, and brandish a knife at her, which he believed would make her cower so that he could do what he wanted to do to her. However, he claimed that instead of cowering, Rocio tried to fight him off, and in response, he attacked her with the knife. He returned a few hours later to hide her body and move it to the spot where she was eventually found. During this interrogation, King also admitted to 3 other assaults that had occurred in the area. However, investigators were a little bit wary of King's confessions because it had a lot of false information in it. For example, the injuries that he described didn't match the wounds that were actually found during the autopsies. But investigators still believed that he was involved. On September 23rd, 2003, just a few days after Tony was arrested, the Daily Mail and The Sun, which are 2 British tabloids, published an article revealing the true nature of who Tony King was. Tony King's real name was Tony Bromwich, and he was originally from Holloway, North London, where he was known as the notorious criminal called the Holloway Strangler. Starting at the age of 19, Tony would prowl the streets of London looking for women walking alone, and he would strangle them until they were unconscious so that he could assault them. He did this to at least 5 women before he was caught. The judge who sentenced him described him as having a Jekyll and Hyde personality because at this time, Tony also had a fiancée. So he would present the nice guy act to the outside world, but a couple of nights a week, he would go on the prowl to commit his crimes.
How do these people end up in relationships? How do these people have wives, have kids, have fiancés, have functioning lives outside of the heinous things they do? It is always crazy to me that they are able to maintain this double life. Wow.
So Tony was sentenced to 10 years in juvenile detention But this was later reduced to 5 years for good behavior.
Juvenile detention. He's 19.
They have a different definition of adulthood, I believe. Because, they can drink at 16. So.
I was just about to say, that's BS because they can drink at 16. What do you mean? Oh, my goodness.
So for them, probably 20 is maybe when somebody wouldn't qualify for juvenile detention. Because 19, you're technically a teenager.
Fine. Fair enough. You're right. I'm not happy about it, but you're right.
But my thing is good behavior. Y'all just said this man like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So what did y'all expect?
For him to act up? For him to not be on his best behavior?
Right. Clearly this man is calculated. I'm sure he knows how to put on a good act for a few years.
Clearly he had a fiance. Clearly he knew how to act well enough to get a fiance. So I'm sure he acted well enough to convince a couple of prosecutors and police guards that he was a good dude. I'm sure he would be able to do that.
And it was revealed that this was not the right decision because just a few weeks after he was released, he attempted to rob a woman at gunpoint. This caused him to get sent back to prison. But he was released just a few years later in 1995.
I'm so shocked. I'm so shocked and surprised that somebody with the capability of strangling a person till they're unconscious would get out of prison and immediately go attack somebody. I'm so surprised. And this is not what this episode is about, and maybe I'll bring it up at a later date. But UK in general is consistently giving out super light sentences for heinous crimes, and it really annoys me. To the point where there are serial killers that have been released in the UK. How? How do you not put the serial killer away forever? In my humble opinion, there is no amount of rehabilitation that can be done on a serial killer that gives them the right to rejoin society. None. None whatsoever. But goodness, that's infuriating that he did all this and he got a slap on the wrist for it.
And soon after his latest release, Tony changed his name and moved to Spain. And it wasn't like this was a secret because the British police actually forwarded his file to the Spanish authorities and cautioned them to keep a close eye on him because he posed a major threat to women. So it was like, y'all know, but y'all let him leave the country.
Well, I'm sure they didn't have him on parole. Cam, he was a model prisoner. Why would we think he would automatically go back to his old trifling abusive ways when he was a model prisoner? He was so good in the jail. Surely he'll be good in society, despite everything that he's done prior to that. But also, Spanish police. I'm looking at y'all mad crazy. Bombastic side eye. Because what do you mean you had the file and you were still doing all of this mental gymnastics to make it this other woman? Because it's giving you wanted to pin a crime on a lesbian.
And people said very similar things. And the Spanish police actually put it back on the British police and said, oh, well, y'all marked him as low risk and we can't investigate every criminal that comes into Spain. Which even if that were true, when somebody came to you and said, hey, my husband was acting a little funny, I think he might have had something to do with this. Y'all didn't even decide to look his name up because if y'all would have, y'all would have seen this.
Oh, of course not. Because remember, we have Dolores. We have the lesbian. We must convict the lesbian. Why do our jobs and actually investigate, especially when you had DNA at the scene, when we could just randomly convict the lesbian with no evidence? Oof.
Trial by media.
Trial by media for sure. But that level of puck passing, that's hilarious. Well, actually, it's y'all fault that we didn't do our job because we didn't want to read your paperwork. That's your fault.
Right. So after his confession, Tony wrote 2 letters to both Rocio and Sonia's mothers. In the letters, he apologized to Alicia for not confessing earlier and for causing a rift between her and Dolores. and he apologized to Sonia's mother for hitting her with his car. However, he recanted these apologies and said that they'd been coaxed out of him by a journalist posing as his lawyer who told him that writing these letters could get him a lighter sentence.
Sir, you can burn in hell.
So once Tony King got a real lawyer, this lawyer claimed that Tony was actually with a man named Robert Graham on the night of Rocio's murder. So detectives then detained this man and interrogated him, but he claimed not to remember anything about that night. But he did insist that he wasn't with King when Rocio was murdered.
Not the selective amnesia.
Right. I'm not really sure why they did this, but investigators put Robert Graham under hypnosis to see if this would help him remember more about that night. While under hypnosis, Robert Graham claimed that he did remember that King had collaborated with Dolores Vasquez to commit Rocio's murder.
Stop it. Stop it right now, Cam. Stop it right now. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm not. Tony King's lawyer declined this narrative and said that detectives were just trying to concoct it to bring Rocio back into the fold and make Tony look guilty. I'm sure he was less mad about the Dolores part and more mad that Robert Graham was still implicating his client.
Of course.
This, of course, led to more rumors that Dolores must have been guilty because she'd gotten King's help to commit these murders. Dolores then held another press conference stating that she'd never even met Tony King. One piece of evidence that detectives tried to bring up was that at one point, Tony had worked as a waiter at the same hotel that Dolores used to be a manager at. But Dolores pointed out in this press conference that when he started working as a waiter, she had long left that hotel. In this conference, kind of just like you were saying earlier, Dev, she said that she was exhausted and she felt like everything she said and did got twisted. Detectives tried to interview Robert Graham again, but he had fled to London by this point and said that he couldn't return back to Spain for financial reasons.
Oh, isn't that convenient?
So now let's get to the trials. Tony was actually going to be facing 2 consecutive trials for Sonia's murder and Rocio's murder. So at a court hearing on November 13th, 2003, which was a court hearing for Sonia's murder, Tony once again changed his story and he testified that one night when he and Graham were hanging out, Robert Graham got a call, and after he hung up, he asked King to go on a drive with him. They ended up meeting up with Rocio, and from what King could see from the car, because he was just a passenger in the situation, it looked to him like Rocio and Robert Graham were lovers. But then a fight broke out, and Robert Graham ended up stabbing Rocio. He asked King to help him move her, and King said that he did it because he felt pressured because of Robert Graham's dominant personality. So after this testimony, Robert Graham was ordered to come back to the country, and he eventually complied, and he stood in front of a judge a month later. He denied having anything to do with Rocio's murder, and he upheld that Dolores Vasquez was behind the crimes. Over the next several months, Tony King attempted to postpone the trial by hiring new legal counsel and changing his story once again. This time, he blamed Robert Graham and Dolores Vasquez. But in February 2005, Dolores Vasquez and Robert Graham were completely exonerated in both cases.
I'm happy for Dolores. I don't believe you, Robert, but I'll talk about that later.
We gonna get into that. So finally, the trial for Sonia's murder began in September of 2005. Tony King apparently had to be dragged into the court, and he was screaming his innocence. This time, he told a new version of events surrounding Sonia's death. He said that after hitting Sonia with his car, he'd gotten out to check on her when someone bashed his head from behind. When he woke up, he was in the back seat with Sonia and Robert Graham was driving. Robert Graham eventually pulled over and dumped Sonia's body, and Tony said that he had tossed the jeans out of the window in hopes that this would help someone find her body. He also claimed that Dolores had organized the entire thing to make herself look innocent. Prosecutors, of course, knew that this was bullshit because all of the evidence at the scene pointed to an attack. Also, a car wash attendant testified that King had asked her to clean the interior of his car, but had specifically asked her not to touch the trunk. When she was cleaning the car, she noticed blood stains and a funky smell. In addition to this, the scene outside of Sonia's home showed no indication of a car accident. Because you would think that if there was a car accident, in addition to some tire marks, there might be paint scuffs or anything like that. But nope, all of the damage was to the rear side of Tony's car, specifically that broken taillight.
Okay, I'm sorry. I gotta do it. I gotta do it to him. Fran, you say that is bullshit. And I'm gonna raise you one better, and I'm calling horse. Because even in this new version of events, now the story is you killed her. You killed her when you hit your car because she was already dead in the back seat, and you just woke up and she's dead in the back seat. But if that's the case, how do we have the forensics that have your DNA under her fingernails? That's very interesting. It's just very interesting. It kind of sounds like your story is horse.
Nah, this man was playing Mad Libs with his alibi for real.
Bro, right. Look, I've heard a better consistent story from a 4-year-old when I asked them where the cookies went.
You hear a better consistent story playing a game of Clue.
It always comes back to the game of Clue, bruh. It always comes back to Clue. Because how? Also, how do you think changing your story 5 times is going to make you look innocent? How do you think that's going to help you? That's the real tea of it all.
This man is unhinged.
Unhinged. And you grasping to try to pull everybody into your nonsense? Because you saw their names in the media? You're doing too much. You're doing too much.
So based on the actual evidence, prosecutors theorized that Tony King must have waited for Sonia as she walked home and attacked her. After he attacked her, he must have put her in the trunk and drove to a place where he could assault her, but she came to and fought back. In November 2005, 2 months after the trial started, Tony King was sentenced to 36 years in prison. 23 years for murder, 8 years for sexual aggression, and 5 years for illegal detention. He was also ordered to pay 300,000 euros to Sonia's family. And I will say, I don't know what the standards for sentencing are in Spain. I would assume that they are generally lighter than what we see in the US because even Dolores was only sentenced to 15 years.
I agree with that statement. I don't know either, but I do agree with that statement. And again, I consistently see very light sentences in a lot of these UK cases that I've looked into or found really interesting. And again, they'll give a serial killer, somebody with 4 bodies, 25 years and let them out. So,
yeah. So now let's get to Rocio's trial. Tony King, of course, was still proclaiming his innocence, and his defense upheld that Dolores Vasquez was the real killer. If you thought that Tony's story that Robert Graham had bashed him in the head after he hit Sonia, which also in that instance, where did he come from? He just popped up out of nowhere. Was he following your car? What?
He couldn't have been in a car because you said he stole your car. So where the hell did he come from?
But okay, if y'all thought that was wild, strap in. Because now Tony King was claiming that on the night of October 9th, 1999, Robert Graham hypnotized him. And shortly after this, 3 people showed up, one of whom was Dolores, and came to the house. Tony said that he didn't really have clear memories of what happened, but when he came to, he claimed that he woke up in a car and saw Dolores stabbing Rocio. To counter this, the prosecutor really just listed all the physical evidence in this case. And I think that one of the saddest parts about this was Rocio's mother, Alicia, actually believed Tony's story. I'm definitely going to touch on this in the discussion too, but I think to her, Dolores had to be responsible. And I think that her accepting Dolores' innocence would mean her accepting all that she had put Dolores through after their 15 years of close friendship, even outside of their relationship.
Yep, and that's usually the case. Nobody wants to admit to the gravity of their wrongdoing.
So after several hours of deliberation, Tony King was found guilty on all counts, although the jury did believe that he'd had help from someone. On May 11, 2006, Tony King was sentenced to 19 years in prison for Rocio's murder and was ordered to pay 210,000 euros to Alicia's mother and 42,000 euros to both Alicia's sister and brother. Later that year, he was also sentenced to 7 more years in the attempted sexual assault of a woman in 2001. The survivor of this assault had recognized him when she saw a news report about Sonia's murder and came forward to police. And if you want to hate this man a little bit more, when he was initially questioned about this, he told police that if he had done it, it wouldn't have ended in an attempt.
This cocky son of a... Are you serious?
He is. That doesn't know how to take accountability. And so Tony King is scheduled to be released in 2059 when he will be in his 90s and hopefully 6 feet deep.
I would prefer him under the jail, personally.
So that brings us to the end of the case, but I did just want to say a couple of notes about some of the other things that had come out around this case and after all this wrapped up. So Rocio's mother, Alicia, maintained her belief in Dolores' guilt, despite people pointing out that she couldn't have been there. And she stated that she can't believe in another truth. And again, I feel like this is her brain not allowing her to accept it. On Dolores' side, in the aftermath of all of this, she struggled with depression and post-traumatic stress. And she even said that now she keeps a log of everything she does every single day, just in case she's questioned again. In 2006, she filed a complaint against Spain's Department of Justice, asking for 4 million euros. They eventually acknowledged their mistakes, and they offered her 120,000 euros. So her and her lawyer pointed out the fact that 120,000 is very different from the 4 million that we requested. And years later, the Department of Justice reassessed this claim. And in 2011, they actually came out and said that Dolores didn't deserve any compensation. And this was based on a 2010 law that essentially stipulated that if there's a murder, the wrongfully accused won't get any compensation from the Department of Justice, which I actually have a problem with for multiple reasons. One, I'm not sure of the specifics of the law, but I don't understand why it being a murder would bar somebody from compensation if they were wrongfully accused. I would hope that specifically, especially if it were a murder, they should get compensation. And also, I'm not sure why that law was retroactively applied to her case. That doesn't make sense.
Well, I will say, Cam, for a moment there, you actually allowed me to have faith in the Spanish government and quickly tore that down for me. Don't know why I would do such a stupid thing. Secondly, I don't agree with this line of thinking, but I could understand the argument they would pose, which is in a murder investigation, everyone's a suspect. And due to the sheer amount of importance of the case, police are allowed to basically do a lot more than if it was just a robbery or something. It's kind of similar how in the United States, if police are tipped off that you're abusing your children and they come in and take your children by force, you cannot then sue them if it is proven that you did not abuse your children. Because in cases involving kids, the priority is protecting children, and your rights as a parent or anything fall second to protecting the child, right? So I could understand that if they try to go with that argument. I don't agree with the argument, but I think that's the argument that they would make. But you retroactively adding it to this case is just because y'all didn't want to pay her money. That's all that is.
And I could see that line of thinking if the stipulation was that you can't be compensated if you were wrongfully arrested. But she's going against the Department of Justice and she was wrongfully convicted. Like, I do get the gravity of a murder, but there should also be a high bar set for convicting someone. And in her case, they convicted her without any physical evidence.
Correct. And they completely ignored evidence that showed that she wasn't at the scene.
And another interesting thing about this case was that prior to 1995, just a few years before she was actually convicted, jury trials were not a thing in Spain. They had only started in 1995. And so a lot of people brought up the fact that, can we trust a jury to convict somebody? Can we trust people with no legal training to convict somebody? And even today, because this is a very famous case in Spain, even today, lawyers will bring up this case in jury trials and will say to the jury, make sure that you are sure because you don't want this to be another case like Dolores Vasquez.
And they're right. And they are completely right.
And I know you got thoughts.
I got several.
One thing I do want to talk about is just like the phenomenon of people's memories and conceptions of a person changing once they realize that they did something bad. Like, you wrote that down too?
Yes, I did. I most definitely did. Because and you literally, in my notes, I have switch up with 3 question marks. That's what I wrote. Because it's so interesting how people will literally hear that you did something and then all of a sudden they have all these negative opinions of you. And so how they were like, oh no, she's just quiet and keeps to herself. Now she's cold and detached. Interesting. Right. And just because somebody is cold and detached doesn't make them a murderer.
Exactly. And it was really because, like, in Spain, of course, the culture is a lot different, but Dolores had been raised in England, and in England, people are just colder and they're more reserved. And people in Spain took that as her being mean, when really that's not how she was.
That's even present here in the United States, because I feel the same way as a Southerner when I go to New York, when I went to see you in Boston. When I go up north, I think those people are mean. Because what do you mean you don't want to tell me good morning because I walked by? It's literally a cultural difference.
Yeah. So my sister was telling me a story one time where her and her friends were at cookout in line. And one of her friends was actually from Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. And this random man started talking to them, as people do in the South. And the friend was looking at them confused, like, why is this man talking to us? Do y'all know him? And it really is a cultural difference, because I am just so used to strangers talking to me. I'm used to talking to strangers about nothing. Am I going to ever see this person again in my life? No. But what can I say? I like to chat.
Exactly. That's a big thing. It's a big thing down south. Even just passing by, saying, excuse me, passing by, how you doing today? We may not have a conversation. I don't really care about your answer, but that is just what we find to be polite down here. So yeah, when I was up there and people was just bumping into each other to walk by and nobody saying anything, I thought it was very rude. But that's the culture up there. And I'm sure if they came down here and saw us do it, like your sister's friend got to see, they think we're weird.
Yeah.
So am I supposed to think people from New York are just cold and detached and automatically murderers? Like, what are you talking about, bruh?
And one of the hardest things I would say about researching this case was just kind of some of the he said, she said that was going around, or really the she said, because in the documentary that I was watching, of course, you can see that both Alicia and Dolores are very hurt by this whole situation. Dolores still loved Rocio. Like, yes, they did not get along, I think, because Dolores was strict and Rocio did not want to be under someone who was strict. But Dolores still had a lot of love for her. She pretty much raised her. And one example of this is when they were talking about Dolores's mother. Alicia claimed that one time she'd seen Dolores hit her own mother and drag her. And in response to this, Dolores was like, I would never put my hands on my mother. My mother is a saint to me. And if I were to put my hands on anyone, it would be someone who put their hands on my mother. And she was even saying that Alicia was jealous of her mother because Dolores was paying her so much attention, and also the fact that Dolores had told her mom that she was the housekeeper essentially and wasn't truthful about the nature of their relationship. This case is really complex because I can definitely see where Alicia's mother was coming from in terms of the police telling her, yeah, we're investigating this person. And you want an answer so badly that you make things fit. Because at one point, she even accused Antonio, Rocio's boyfriend.
Of course. I completely agree with you. And I get it, especially like with a murder, and especially a murder of a loved one and a murder of a child. You want things to make sense, and the world has to make sense. Because also, this is another thing that people struggle with in general. It doesn't make sense that somebody that you don't know, that somebody random would stalk your child and kill them. That doesn't make any sense. And statistically, you're most likely to be killed by somebody that you know, somebody who has access to you. So it's hard to force your brain to make that jump of this random stranger came in and hurt your child. It makes more sense that the person my child had a difficult relationship with would come in and hurt my child. And while I understand, this is something that I yell at people about in my personal life, is you cannot disregard facts because of your emotions. You may feel the way that you feel about it, and that is valid and that is fair, but you do not get to disregard evidence, physical, clear evidence, because of how you feel. Because just because you feel like she did it, it doesn't change the fact that his DNA is on your daughter's body. It doesn't change the fact that it's there. And you have to accept that fact. Because also, if you're going to believe his version of events, do you also believe that the Spanish court that has been trying to convict Dolores is all of a sudden going to scapegoat her and put this other dude in place when they've been trying to keep her in prison for years? Again, there has to come a time where you have to accept that. And I understand that it's hard, but it's also not fair to you to live in that state of denial and delusion. You can't move on if you're living in that state.
And I think too, like, it would have made a little bit more sense if Tony's story was that Dolores had orchestrated this from behind the scenes. But even in his different crazy versions of the story, Dolores was there physically. Mm-hmm. Based on her alibi and what other people had seen, it would have been nearly impossible for her to be there. And it would have been impossible for her to be there in the way that Tony had described.
Exactly. And it is your job to accept that. But I'm also sure, like you were saying before, you don't want to accept that because it makes you look like a terrible person for how you have treated somebody who loved you the way that you did.
And loved your family. Like, it wasn't just Rocio and Rosa. It was also Alicia's parents. Alicia's father loved Dolores. Even at Rocio's funeral, he was in a bad state. And Dolores was helping him. She was wiping his tears. Yeah. Like, they were close.
Right. I agree. I understand it's a very difficult position to be in. But you have to take accountability for how you treated her in this scenario as well. And I know you probably don't want to do that, but you have to. Because you treated her poorly. And there is direct evidence that doesn't put her at the scene. That excludes her from the scene. Because the reality situation is the police were trying to get her so bad. If they wanted her, they would have found her DNA at the scene. They would have found a way to put her DNA there. Or to get her DNA there, excuse me. So if it's not there, if she's completely exonerated, you have to let that go and you have to move on. But on a slightly lighter note, I want to fall down a rabbit hole with you that I fell down years ago. And it is the rabbit hole of hypnosis. In hypnosis, you are encouraging somebody to do whatever you ask them to do in hypnosis, right? But here's the T on hypnosis. Somebody whose internal dialogue would not allow them to do something that you have asked them to do won't do it. So if somebody's under hypnosis and you tell them to go over there and punch her in the face, if they go over there and punch them in the face, they wanted to do that already. But if they don't want to do it. They don't have the ability to do it. And it's very interesting. And there's a very, very good, I have to go look it up. I watched it forever ago, but it's a very, very interesting documentary on the history of hypnosis and how people think that like, oh, you can just get people to do anything if they're hypnotized. And that's not true. You can only get them to do things that they would already do without the encouragement. Because basically all hypnosis does is lower your inhibitions. So it's equivalent to getting drunk. So you know how they say a drunk man's words are a sober man's thoughts? What you're willing to do when you're hypnotized are things you are willing to do already.
Yeah. And I mean, that's not really surprising given what Tony King had already done back in England. But that does bring up someone I want to talk about, which is Robert Graham. I do believe he was involved. I believe him and Tony did it together. And he was mad Tony was throwing him under the bus.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you because there was somebody who testified that they saw two men getting out of a car. And in my opinion, those two men are Robert and Tony.
So I will talk about that point, which was that was related to Dolores's car, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they did kind of talk about that in the documentary too. And Dolores was essentially saying, yeah, I never let anybody drive my car. But she did later remember that while they were doing the search, at one point, Alicia's brother-in-law had asked to borrow the car. And she said that him and his friend had used the car and were gone for hours. And when he brought it back, she was like, don't ask to use my car again. Because she felt like he'd been drinking. And I feel like what could have happened was when asked, Dolores was like, no, I don't never let anybody use my car. And she'd potentially forgotten about it because it's an emotional moment. And maybe what the brother-in-law and his friend were doing was trying to check out the scene and maybe look for other evidence the police could have missed. Like, I feel like that could have been what happened. But an interesting thing and a reason that police believe that there was maybe more than one person involved is because where Rocio's body was placed, you would actually have had to like lift up a fence to be able to get under there to get to where she was placed. And so it seems improbable that somebody acting alone could have lifted up the fence and also pulled her body through all by themselves. And also, I didn't mention this because it hasn't really been proven, but police also suspected that Tony and Robert could have been responsible for another cold case of a young girl in southern Spain that had happened around the same time because men matching their description were seen around the area around the time that this person was murdered. So I think that they did this on a somewhat regular basis. They would go on the hunt together.
I agree. I don't buy Robert being innocent at all. Don't buy that at all. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe Tony's version of events because he changed him 73 times. But I do believe Robert is definitely more involved and he got off scot-free. That's definitely how I feel.
And I really think the only reason Tony was convicted is because he had left that cigarette butt at the scene.
And you want to know something? I thought that cigarette butt was interesting because it made me think about when we covered Darren and the way that he was purposefully leaving evidence to get caught. It made me feel like that because you just so happen to leave cigarette butts with your DNA on them at two separate crime scenes and tissues at two separate crime scenes. Feels like I had said before, it's giving signature. It's not giving accidental.
Well, I think the cigarette butt specifically was likely not accidental, but it was mindless. When I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, well, in Europe, smoking is just a lot more common. And it was probably his way of, after a relatively stressful event for him, he probably lit a cigarette and put it out in the same area. And likely did not really understand DNA, as it was the late 90s. Probably didn't have a good understanding that that could be tied back to him. Because I think around that time, people just assumed it was like blood and DNA extracted. They didn't really understand that your saliva could be tied back to you. Fingerprints, really. No, the fingerprints they probably did understand. But yeah, skin cells, they didn't really have a good understanding of how much evidence is left at a scene and how much can be tied back to you.
Yeah, I could understand that. I could see that. Girl, yeah, this one is a wild one. Honestly, I could sit here and talk about this case with you for hours, but I think these lovely people need to get on their way. So that's all I got, friend.
Well, thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode. And if you have any other questions about this that you'd like for us to answer, definitely put them in the question box if you're listening on Spotify, or you can reach out to us on social media to ask us. I would also like to thank the Case File podcast and the HBO documentary called Dolores, The Truth About the Wanninkhof Case for providing most of the material for this episode. If you'd like to check out photos related to this case, follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram and TikTok.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish podcast. And if you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, please be sure to leave any comments or questions. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.